All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live coaching call. Today we have a very, very special guest. I'm so excited about this conversation. Colleen Wilkinson is here, and you're in Houston, right, Colleen?
I am.
Awesome. Well, welcome to the call. You're going to be talking to us about trauma-informed education for Montessori schools. And I'm curious to know, this topic is so important, and it comes up in a lot of conversations with Montessori administrators, Montessori guides, Montessori parents, and just overall community. What is your background, and why is this such an important piece for you in particular?
So for me, my first sort of experience with childhood trauma was that I was a traditional teacher in a 4-year-old classroom on 9/11, and that was sort of a learning curve for me, where I realized that I didn't really have a good grasp on how to guide children through who had experienced community violence, and we're trying to process that. And then later on, after I became a Montessori teacher, I had children in my classroom who had been adopted from overseas. And then later I adopted my own daughter from foster care. And I realized that the tools that I had of positive discipline weren't quite meeting the needs of the children that I had in my care. So I began to learn more about trauma and adverse childhood experiences and ways to therapeutically parent. And then I have translated those ways into what I'm doing in the classroom with great success, and finding the ways to truly meet the needs of the children in front of me rather than the ideals of children that I'd like to have. And that also so many people are still stuck in that behaviorist approach of teaching and discipline, that I began to see the need in my community for everyone to see this trauma-informed lens.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting. So, one of the questions that has come across our desk is, well, why you're a marketing company? Why are you talking about trauma-informed processes in Montessori schools? And I know part of the answer I have, and part you have a beautiful answer to this question as well. But we always have to consider, when we're interacting with our families, with our parents, every interaction creates an impact and an impression on how we are supporting the families and children we work with. So as we know, if you've been around for a while, one negative interaction can wreak havoc on your community, because it's going to come up in conversations at the dinner table, with their friends, on the soccer field, coffee shop. And so, when this isn't particularly about marketing, but it is about relationships. And I know, Colleen, you've got a really good answer to this question too.
Yeah, in addition to being about relationships with our students, this trauma-informed lens also has informed me as an administrator and leader in my school, and how I interacted with my colleagues, how I've interacted with parents, how to get parents to be engaged if they've experienced educational trauma. There's so much richness that I can add to how I see people when I understand the needs behind their behavior.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you can make that connection for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Awesome. So Colleen, without further ado, I'm going to let you take it away and teach us all about this.
Okay, awesome. Well, I am so excited to be here. I'm Colleen Wilkinson. I'm a 3 to 6 trained AMS Montessori teacher. I'm an early childhood administrator. I'm a parent. I'm an advocate and consultant. I do professional development all over the U.S. About trauma-informed discipline practices and how to help children be successful. I live in Houston with my wife and my 17-year-old daughter. How she's 17, I don't know. And we have many, many pets, 3 dogs and 11 rabbits that my daughter's raising for FFA. We're trying to sort of hack that Montessori adolescent scheme of being related to earth and nature and responsibility and farm work by doing some FFA, Future Farmers of America. So we are a rabbit farm. And I have been excited to be able to share this work. I'm also a part of the American Montessori Society Peace and Social Justice Committee, and do a lot of work with that organization as well.
You just recently did a workshop at a training center, right?
Yeah, so this past weekend was actually an incredibly busy weekend for me. I presented at a conference here in Houston called the Institute of Montessori, and was honored to be asked to do like what's called Montessori Voices, which is sort of a TED Talk that AMS is putting together. So a 10-minute TED Talk, essentially, but under the umbrella of Montessori Voices on Saturday. And then on Sunday, I flew out to Colorado and presented at Mecker Montessori Education Center of the Rockies, and was able to share this FRAMA there as well. So I try to go quick often, and so in addition to working with schools, sometimes I work with training centers or AMS directly to share this information as far and wide as possible.
Yeah, we feel very lucky to have you.
Well, thank you so much. I'm excited. So one of the misconceptions I started coming across when I started to talk to people about trauma is that people would say like, well, I don't work with a student body that experiences trauma. And I just have to tell everybody that nothing could be further from the truth. Everyone has students who experience trauma. So back in the mid-90s, Kaiser Permanente and the CDC did a study. And it started as a weight loss study, and some good doctor was a scientist in mind. And they wanted to figure out why people weren't losing weight. And when they got down to it, after they had surveyed over 17,000 people, they found that it was these adverse childhood experiences that were impacting their folks' whole lifetime. It was impacting their social emotional health as adults, impacting their ability to lose weight, impacting their alcoholism, and so many other factors in their life, risk of suicide, depression, diabetes, cancer, and a 20-year shortened lifespan based on these factors that had happened in childhood, things that they'd often been told, get over it, that was a long time ago. So what they discovered is that that's not how trauma works. It carries with us for a long time. When they did that original ACEs study, they studied big things that we'd all recognize as childhood trauma: physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, the death of a parent, a divorce, the incarceration of a parent, witnessing domestic violence. But they didn't include community violence like my students had experienced on 9/11, or like students in Charlottesville or Parkland, Florida have experienced. They didn't consider natural disasters. And as a teacher in Houston, I will tell you, hurricanes and floods are pretty traumatic for our students, and they carry those fears with them for a long time. And they didn't include in that original study educational trauma. And educational trauma is a term I've started using to describe trauma that happens in an educational setting. That can be bullying, it can be harsh discipline, like locking a child in a closet, or these other kinds of things that we know are not okay, or the experience of racism and bias in the classroom, which we know happens, unfortunately. But what they found also is that 70% of Americans will experience an adverse childhood trauma, and usually it's more than one. In fact, the average number is 2.67. So the more ACEs you have, the greater impact that has over our lifetime. And that there's no information about socioeconomics, racial identity, or demographic that can create an identifier. Poverty alone is not an ACE, so we can't predict how trauma is going to impact people in different groups based on any of those demographic factors. Mm-hmm. So the outside outcomes are all based on the impact of brain development. So I like a good visual, so I've borrowed this one. In typical development, you have survival at the bottom. Babies are answered when they cry, they get milk, they get food, they get what they need. So their need to learn about survival is pretty small because they know they're safe. Then they can build in regulation. From there, we have social, emotional skills, and cognition. And brains develop from the bottom up. So if we're living in our reptilian brain of survival, and it's in a very large space in our thought process. Am I going to have enough food? Will someone take care of me? Is something the matter? Do I need to protect myself? Then our regulation we have to work much harder to self-regulate, right? And that all happens in the limbic system. And then cognition is very small. And cognition and that neocortex, frontal lobe, all that is where we actually learn. So this trauma impacts learning in the classroom every single day. It impacts impulse control, self-regulation, critical thinking, retention, memory, neurological and physical development, emotional regulation, behavioral needs, social skills, and some basic trust, right? If you don't trust the world is a safe place, if your life experience has told you that the world is not a safe place, you're not likely to be worried about the movable alphabet, right? And so all these little things, if we can meet the needs behind these behaviors, we can really impact the child's whole lifetime.
Right. And every single guide, every single administrator can think about a child right now that struggles with that.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you wouldn't mind going back to that list, because that,
yeah, no problem.
I mean, that's key. And we see that so clearly, especially in a Montessori environment, right? Because it is meant to meet the needs of the child, but if there's something going on that's deeper, we see it almost immediately.
Absolutely.
So yeah, this is huge.
Yeah, and it every single classroom, and here's a not so great statistic, but it's really illustrative. So if we know that statistics tell us that 1 in 4 girls has been sexually assaulted by the time she's 18, that means at some point, statistically, there's been a child in a classroom who's been, in my classroom probably, who's being sexually assaulted without us knowing. All those teachers those girls are going to have over the years with no one knowing, right? Maybe I think, oh, she has a poor working memory, or maybe she lacks impulse control or has adapted some other behavior. But I don't have any way of knowing. We really can't predict who has experienced trauma and who hasn't. And that's why these things become universal precautions. When we treat people with a trauma-informed lens, we're just assuming, since we know the majority of our population is going to have some adverse childhood experience, we can treat everyone with the respect that they need to feel successful and feel safe in our classrooms. Mm-hmm. Whether we know they've done, we don't have to be trauma detectives, right? Yeah. Because we can't always know. Right.
Absolutely. And that visual was so perfect because, just about the brain and the needs that we have, like, it's just flipped. It's not that they have, a serious disability. It's that their brain is wired this way. Right. And I imagine you're going to talk about, how we can rewire it and help them, through processes. And of course, Montessori is the perfect environment to do that.
Absolutely.
But what a beautiful visual on that. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, so if we think about the lifetime impacts for folks who've had adverse childhood experiences, we have to consider that first there's a historical trauma, and there's we say an emerging science. It's really been around for like 15 to 20 years now. It's called epigenetics. And the short version of the research is they took a mouse and they shocked her while giving her the smell of cherry blossom. And then they impregnated that mouse. They did not shock her while she was pregnant. And then when they had the baby mice were afraid of the smell of cherry blossom, though they'd never been shocked in association. That's a very short condensation of the research, but there it is. So so this idea that we can be wired for fear, not only because of our own experience, but by the experiences of our ancestors, is really powerful. And we've come to know that it can even change the way our DNA is expressed. So we really have to, it's still learning more about that and learning more about how that plays into resilience as well. Then we have our social conditions, our local context. I can be impacted by the neighborhood I live in. I can be impacted by the community violence that's happening around me. And then those adverse childhood experiences directly, which lead to disrupted neurodevelopment, which lead to social, emotional, cognitive impairment, which lead to the adoption of health risk behaviors, disease, disability, and social problems, and ultimately untimely death, right? So we know this, we often hear, like I said, people say, oh, that happened when you were 3, get over it. And certainly, like, so my daughter who's adopted from foster care, she's been home with me 10 years now. And people say, well, shouldn't she be over this thing that happened to her when she was 3 years old? And I have to say, that's just not the way trauma works. I wish I could say, yeah, oh yeah, she's over, we're totally moved on. But that's just not the way trauma works. So there's a lot of modalities of support that frameworks for implementing behavior programs. Trust-based relational intervention from Dr. Karen Purvis is my favorite. She's out of Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas. Conscious discipline with Becky Bailey, lots of great work there. Collaborative and proactive solutions from Ross Green. And Beyond Consequences, Logic and Control, Heather Forbes. There's books associated with every single one of those that I would suggest people read. And then you can kind of pick what works for you and what seems natural. For me, trust-based relational intervention, TBRI for short, is so in line with what we already believe as Montessorians. I know a lot of other people love conscious discipline. I do too. It is a great modality that aligns with Montessori philosophy very beautifully. Mm-hmm. But the core concept of all of those is that connected, respectful, and consistent interactions with trustworthy adults help set the stage for resilience and healing. And that thought process was confirmed last week. A study came out of BYU that said one of the greatest protective factors for children who've experienced ACEs, the protective factor, the counter ACE, the core to resilience, was about a relationship with a trustworthy adult. And in Montessori, because we spend 3 years with students over time, we have an even greater opportunity to make that impact. And we were talking very briefly earlier about the work of Brene Brown. When she did her research into shame in the educational environment, she showed that 80% of people could remember a time in school when they felt shamed by a teacher and the profound impact that had on their view of their education and who they were as learners. And that only 60% could remember a time when they felt connected, respected, and that they had a positive relationship that positively impacted them in school. So, and the thing about relationships is you might be a positive impact on one person and be that negative impact on another. So we have to carefully cultivate that relationship. I always want to be in that 60% that had a positive impact. I don't ever want to hope that I felt shame at school that made someone feel that way. So what we don't do is first of all, we don't pity children who've experienced trauma. They don't need our pity. They're survivors, they're overcomers, they don't need it, and it will not help. We don't shame, blame, that authoritarian old school approach, including timeout and spanking. And I find that nothing will lead a dyed-in-the-wool true believer of Montessori back to that authoritarian, the way they were raised approach faster than a child who's misbehaving. So we have to really be conscientious of where we are triggered. We don't do threats, and of course, as Montessorians, we know we're not doing sticker charts or rewards. We have to be very careful with expulsion, and we never do loss of recess or privileges. We don't do rewards, especially candy or food rewards. We have to be conscious not to give gifts and do parenting. They have parents, and to think very carefully about saviorism. If we get into a place where I think I'm the only one who can save this child, then we're not in a healthy place with good boundaries. So we have to be conscientious of what not to do, which I know we don't like to talk about as Montessorians, but there it is nonetheless.
It's a reminder, right? It's always a good reminder because even, we're not immune to it. Our own experiences will come out regardless of how much we know about the practice of being a Montessori guide or a Montessori administrator.
Absolutely. And so like you said, Montessori is already on the path, right? We have calm, uncluttered, visually peaceful environments that are sensory rich, with a huge emphasis on movement, right, in all of our classrooms. And we believe in external supports and scaffolding. I always liken this for people to the movable alphabet because it's one of my favorite lessons to give. So if I see a student struggling with the movable alphabet, if I see them trying really hard and getting frustrated, I'm going to observe them having the problem. I'm going to observe the struggle and see what the need is. Do they need fewer letters? Is this box too big? Are the letters getting jumbled up on the way to the rug? What do they need? And then I can provide a support and scaffold to help them gain that skill. But the support that we would do for academics should be the support we would do for behavior and social emotional learning. So the same intentional teaching, the same observation and trying new things. Whoop, that didn't work. Let me make some more, find some new data, observe, correct. That can happen again and again. The same way I would move my shelves if I had a classroom full of runners this year, and I would say, let me break up these pathways in this classroom where that's happening. I would change my environment. The same thing can be true for behavior and social emotional learning and discipline. We already believe in having those consistent routines and expectations. Most Montessori schools have some type of mindfulness, mindsight, yoga being taught, intentional emotional awareness. We're pretty good about doing that social coaching piece, and that we have that classroom design with the awareness of each child's needs. And that respectful interactions are the heart of Montessori. This is what we believe. The children are human beings to whom respect is due, right? That's a very core piece of our Montessori philosophy. So when we believe that, we can do what we call create felt safety. So we know that when people come into our school, that they are safe. But people don't always feel safe if they've experienced adverse childhood experiences. So we can create felt safety. Most of us do this really naturally. We think, okay, where am I going to eat? Who am I going to ask for help? And where's the bathroom? That's the core of felt safety. Right? So if I'm going to a big conference, I'm like, okay, what's the plan for lunch? Where are the bathrooms? And where's the help desk? Those are the things I need to know. The same is true for children, right? They need to know that there's going to be food. They need to know that they can go to the bathroom when they need to without shame. They can take care of their bodily functions. And they need to know that there's going to be someone they can ask for help, and that that person is going to respond in a loving, caring way, and that they want to help them. So those are the core pieces of felt safety, physical felt safety. Then we can move into psychological safety, where we have space to be vulnerable, space to try new things and make mistakes, space to communicate concerns, and to be held accountable without shame, and to be celebrated and acknowledged for our achievements. So all those things contribute to a sense of felt safety. It's really tangible safety. And we believe in Montessori that we have a calm, self-regulated, spiritually prepared teacher, right? We can't do that if we're not doing our own work, because like we talked about, it can be, working with children is a giving job. It's a pouring out of our own self. So we have to do really, really conscientious work of taking care of ourselves. And we see the need behind the behavior and believe that behavior is communication. So if I know that every behavior, positive, negative, everything these children do, everything the adults do as well, right, communicates to me something about what their needs are. And I stay observant and curious. Sometimes in therapeutic parenting, we use the phrase, curious, not furious, right? Like I'm going to try to figure out what the need is behind the behavior. And then when I can meet that need and fill that cup, we can start to see behavior that's disruptive dissipate. And we like to, a way we do that, for example, is this reframing of attention seeking as relationship seeking. So sometimes when I'm called in and consult, people will tell me like, oh, I have this student, he does all this stuff for attention, it's just for attention. It's so disruptive, he can't be on his own, he just needs my attention all the time. And yes, that's true. A child who is seeking relationship and connection will do it however they can. So if we can be really intentional, of filling that cup and meeting that need for relationship and connection, we can meet the need behind the behavior. Because and sometimes people are given the bad advice to, oh, ignore that behavior, ignore the need for attention, and they'll stop asking. That's true, they will, because we'll have proven ourselves as unsafe, untrustworthy adults. Not because their need for attention goes away, not for their need for relationship goes away, but because they have learned that we are not the one who will be there for them.
Mm.
And that we always seek out communication with parents. It's a two-way street. We have to ask parents to communicate with us, but I want people to be conscientious that parents may not always feel comfortable talking about their children's trauma. If you can imagine being a parent and let's say 3 or 4 years ago, you fell on hard times and you had to use the food bank, maybe the lights weren't always on, it was a really rough moment. But things have changed. We've come back together. We've, changed jobs, done whatever we needed to do to get back on our feet. I'm not likely to come to my child's teacher and say, yes, Johnny experienced some food scarcity a few years ago when we were having these financial troubles. And since we've moved into a new position in life and we're okay, but I think his behavior might be rooted in this moment in our times. I'm not likely to say that as a parent because I have big feelings about it as well. No parent wants to be in those shoes where they're struggling to meet their child's needs. So they're not always likely to tell us. They're also not likely to tell us when they are the ones struggling with trauma. So I think it's very wise of us to be conscientious that all the adults we're interacting with, parents, teachers, etc., also have their own issues that they are working through. And we really need to be mindful of that. We have to be mindful of our roles and responsibilities. We want to have connection and relationship with everybody, but we're not therapists. Or most of us as teachers are not therapists, right? Maybe someone in your school team is, but it's not likely the classroom teacher, right? So we are not called to be therapists. We're not called to solve those children's big emotional struggles. We can't meet those needs. We're not diagnosticians, and we have to be conscientious that we're not overstepping those bounds. And as Montessorians, we believe in developmentally appropriate lessons and expectations. So one of my, Emily doesn't know this, but I tell this story about her all the time. When she was my daughter's teacher, right when she came home, right when I first met my daughter, and my daughter was 7, but she'd been in foster care for many years. So she needed work from the first plane of development. So Emily would get materials from my 3 to 6 classroom and present them in her lower elementary classroom to meet the need of the child that was developmentally appropriate, right? She was able to be flexible and do the developmentally appropriate lesson for the child that she had. And I will always, always appreciate that. It was very helpful. And the most important aspect of the Montessori classroom isn't the pink tower or the colored bead stair. It's the relationship you have with each one of your students. So it is the most impactful piece of what we do. People don't always remember golden beads, right, or test tubes, but they'll remember, oh, I had this teacher. I had this teacher who really loved me, or this teacher who spent all this time teaching me to sew. It's about that relationship that you have together. And that's really the core piece of philosophy for me. So then how do we respond to disruptive behavior? Obviously, when I get called in to work with schools, this is usually there's a problem, right? Or they're seeing that they don't have the tools. So this is Karen Purvis, and she is the doctor and the genius behind trust-based relational intervention. And one of the key things she talks about is this ideal response. First is immediate, right? Brain science tells us that if we respond within 3 seconds, that the brain can learn right then, right? That we're direct. We are talking directly to the child. This comes naturally to us as Montessorians. That's one of the reasons when I learned this way, I was like, oh, this is already what I do. I'm, down on one knee, looking the child in the eye, sometimes taking their hand in my hand. And I'll tell you, when I was in a conference one time and she was saying this, and she was saying, get on your knees, look your child in the eyes. And the other people around me were like, oh, mind blown. And I was like, well, that's Montessori. So I was already on that path, right? So I think it's important for us to recognize these ways we're already doing it. We are so far ahead of the curve as Montessorians. E is for efficient. This is one place where I find as Montessorians we're not as ahead of the curve, because we love our words and we can get very wordy with our explanations when really sometimes children need shorter, more efficient phrases of what we expect. Less flowery words, more direct, efficient words. And that they're action-based. So I might say, if say a child's taken a spindle out of my hands. I might say, put the spindle back here in my hand, please. Put the spindle back here in my hand, but I'm never going to take it from them, right? Because of the sensory neuromotor loop, which means if I do the thing I heard about, that then I remember it more. So if I take it from them, I've just taught them that I will take things for them. But if they give it back to me, right, they are building a pathway in their brain for doing the right thing. And then we practice. I'll say, okay, now say, may I have the spindle, please? And then they can ask me for it. And we're practicing the appropriate social behavior. We're practicing what they should do, right? And it's action-based. We're going to do it together. And then, of course, L is leveled at behavior. Children are not bad. Behaviors are not always desirable, but children are not bad. They are desperate to communicate. There are no bad children. There are children desperate to communicate the only way they know how. And behavior, this is a Karen Purvis quote, behavior is the communication of a child who feels they have no voice. So we want to give them that voice and have them practice that with us.
Powerful.
Yeah.
That's
And so Karen Purvis also talks about 4 levels of engagement: playful, structured, calming, and protective. The vast majority of discipline we can do from playful engagement, whether that's, hey, do you want to try asking me that again with a respectful tone of voice? Or saying like, oh, the beads went on the floor, what are we going to do, right? Just simple playful engagement. The vast majority of it can be done that way. I mean, even one time I had a child who was very upset. We had a you know how sometimes you're just having a day? Your whole class is just having a day.
usually around the full moon.
Yeah, it was raining outside, so we had to eat indoors, which we never do. We always eat outside. And of course, because it was raining and we were indoors, there had been rice served, so it's just all over the floor and sticky. And our routines are off and everything. So I had this particular child helping me because I knew already that to be successful, he needed to be closer to me. While other children might be able to move on to nap or to extend a day, that because of our changes in routines, that he would need to have more connection. So I had him closer to me when we were sweeping up, and I'd stacked up chairs on the table so I could really get that rice up. And he looked at me, and I can't remember what made him angry in the moment, but he took his arm and he swiped the chairs off the table. And I looked at him, and in that split second, I had to make a decision of like, how am I about to engage, right? I can get angry, I can get frustrated, I can try to get authoritarian and be like, pick those chairs up right now. But for whatever reason, in that split second, I took out my arm and I also pushed a chair off the table. And I said, gravity, it works every time. This is called gravity. Do you want to practice some more gravity? Well, this child thought I had lost my mind, right? Like, oh, this lady's nuts. So he was totally taken off guard. And he was like, sure. So I said, great, let's pick up these chairs and we'll go practice some more gravity. So we stacked up the chairs, and it must have been near Easter time. I had some chalk eggs, and we just stood and dropped them off the back porch over and over again and practiced playing with gravity. Like, look at that gravity. What do you think if this one goes, let's find something heavier. Let's find something lighter. What would happen? Now, I could have spent that time being frustrated, engaging in a power struggle with that child, trying to force him to pick up the chair, trying to get him to comply or be obedient. But instead, because I chose playful engagement, I created a deeper connection with that child. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying you should go out and harm all your materials and your classroom chairs and such, but what I'm saying is that, again, your most important thing in the classroom is your relationship. Even if I make you walk away from that rice.
Right. And I feel like when you have that deeper connection, you're better able to make those quick decisions.
Yeah.
Right. If we're not connecting with the child in a way that truly understands them, mm-hmm. We might revert back to that authoritative, approach. Right. And of course we have to be kind with ourselves as well.
Sure, absolutely.
And it's
a practice.
Right, right. And you got to practice to rewire your brain.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a huge one.
And it's so antithetical to the way so many of us were raised that it doesn't always feel natural. And it definitely, sometimes I get the feedback of people like, well, why would you choose to connect with that child? Or why would you choose a compromise for a child who's arguing with you or being mouthy? And again, it goes back to like, what is my real goal for that child? To make them feel empowered, to make them feel heard, to give them voice, right? So if I know that behavior is communication, I don't have to take it personally. I can take my ego out of it and just know that they're trying to communicate something that's not going well. It goes back to that phrase, and I can't remember who said it, so I don't want to misattribute the quote, but that the child's not giving me a hard time, the child is having a hard time. And so we really want to make sure we do that. Something I think we do well is structured engagement. I think that for many Montessorians, this idea of like, do you want to choose the dinosaur puzzle or do you want to choose the golden bee work is like so natural. This or that. Structured engagement. You can play with the Legos or the blocks, but the pink tower is closed. Right? We can do that. That's structured. So if we can't get it with playful, sometimes we have to get a little more structured. We're still warm and loving, but we're still, as this is from Darla Miller, she always says, as kind as possible, as firm is necessary. And that's what I think of when I think of structured behavior. I'm still warm. I'm still with you. We're still here together. But now we're just talking about here's the limit. So my tone of voice has changed. My demeanor's changed a little bit for structured engagement. And then there's calming engagement, where we're really going to have to calm someone down. They've already lost control of their body. They're completely dysregulated. We're going to talk about that in just a second. And then protective engagement. Protective engagement is when we have to clear a room, ask everyone to leave, to keep the child safe. Now, it should happen so rarely, so very rarely. Most of us are not trained in psychological restraint, all those things that would need to do protective moments. But the goal is, if we can catch emotions when they're big in playful or structured ways, we can go to that protective mode even less. And we need to be conscientious if we're doing equity work and we're doing like anti-bias work, that we're being really conscientious. Because if you look at the data from the Office of Civil Rights, it collects data on who's expelled from schools, who's restrained in schools. And it clearly shows that children of color are more impacted by that protective modalities or expulsions than other children. So we have to be really conscientious that we are doing our own work before going to those areas.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And if we're, let's see, calming. So when we talk about calming, I think of Bruce Perry. And Bruce Perry, for calming someone down who's dysregulated, has given us these 3 R's. That the first step is to regulate. And we often think of regulation as something the child needs to do, like you need to calm down, but telling someone to calm down is a terrible idea. Yeah. Adults and children alike, it doesn't work for anybody, but they need to get regulated. So I often see this work best when we co-regulate. Would you like to sit in my lap? Let's take some deep breaths together. I've seen a lot of like little viral videos will come out. They're so great of a child who's maybe having a giant meltdown, and either like the principal or a school resource officer like laying on the floor next to them, just deep breathing. Or I saw one of a teacher singing to a child out in the hallway, right? These co-regulation techniques where we're calming down together. And truth be told, if a child is having that big of a reaction, we are also having our own amygdala reaction to that. That co-regulation is doing just as much for us as it is for them. So practicing those deep breathing. Then once they're calmer, we can relate, because they still need to know that we're connected. We're here. I'm with you. I'm not abandoning you or rejecting you because you had a tantrum. I'm not abandoning you or rejecting you because you got dysregulated. We're still on the same team. I am with you. And then once we've got that bottom brain and midbrain going, then we can talk about reason, right? In that, this is my brain here, in your brain, the frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex right here, where we're talking about what can we learn from this moment? What can we do differently in the future? What behaviors do we need to change? That can only happen after we're regulated and reconnected.
Mm-hmm.
So Bruce Perry,
sometimes that takes they don't happen quickly, right?
No.
Sometimes they are separated, where you got regulate and relate, and then reasoning comes way later.
Way later. Yeah. Once I'm feeling safe again, right? It goes back to that. If I'm safe to make mistakes, if I'm safe to be vulnerable, because listen, no child wants to have a giant tantrum in front of their peers. That doesn't feel good to anybody, right? Just like no adult, like if I'm in the airport having a meltdown that my flight's been canceled, I'm on top of frustrated beyond belief. I'm also incredibly embarrassed that I'm having a meltdown, right? So it doesn't feel good for anybody. No one wants to be dysregulated. But when we have gotten them regulated and are self-regulated and reconnected, then we can talk about what happens. Like you said, it could even sometimes be the next day. And it also is one of those pieces for us as Montessorians where we use the powers of observation. And I can think, what was the antecedent? What happened before this person got completely dysregulated? Mm-hmm. And I will tell you, like for my daughter, it was often food, right? So I was able to tie like, oh, she's hungry to these things. And that goes back to that felt safety thing of why should food be available, right? So we can try to see the need behind the behavior to hopefully cut some of those bigger dysregulation times off at the knees before they even get to this level of intervention. But when we need calming intervention, these 3 R's are really powerful. When I first gave this workshop, I gave it for the first time at a Montessori for Social Justice conference. And afterward, a teacher came up to me and she had tears in her eyes. And she said, I understand that what you're talking about is my childhood. And I see that it's impacting my life, my success in the classroom, and my relationship with my students. And that she had been afraid to connect with her students because of the way she was treated as a child. And the more I talk, the more I've given this workshop, I've gotten so many examples over the years of teachers who will tell me about their own educational trauma and the things that happen to them. So if you polled a bunch of teachers, you'd hear these ideas of, oh, I became a teacher because this thing happened to me. For one of my friends, she told me that she was 5 and living in Arkansas the first time a teacher told her she was going to hell for being Muslim, right? There are all these experiences that we have as children. Some of us have impacted our life choices that are like, you know what, I'm going to become a teacher because that wasn't right, and I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen to someone else, right? But what that does also is sometimes mean we're not taking care of our mental health, and that we're not, that we can take on, if we're not keeping those good boundaries, we can take on the emotions of our students. So we have to be really conscientious that our teachers' mental health is taken care of. They're taking their time off, right? If they're not afraid and there's no shame or stigma around getting help if need be, whether that be medical therapy, whatever it is, people should not feel stigma around taking care of their mental health. And that we're not having this caregiver fatigue, right? Where we're feeling that we have community to talk about it, that when we ask for help as teachers, we really need that help. So sometimes what I'll hear people say is, well, I asked an administrator for help, but when they come in, they're so frustrated that they've had to come help me that then I don't feel like I can ask for help anymore. I know as an administrator, that's not ever my goal. I want my teachers to know that if they need to tag out, if they need to take 3 minutes to get their head on straight, that's a very human, normal behavior. If they have a child who they're struggling with and they need me to come to an observation, that's what I'm here for. We're here for the students, right? So those should be the most important pieces of my job, is supporting those teachers and supporting healthy outcomes for children. So I can help mitigate that caregiver fatigue by adequately supporting those teachers. And like we talked about very briefly, that parent trauma, and that is a real thing, and we can navigate respectful parent engagement. There was a big article that came out, I think it was in the Washington Post, about parent engagement in the PTO and why certain groups of parents feel they don't want to join PTO or PTA, right? And that so much of it went back to their own experiences in school. If you've had a negative experience in school, it's not likely that you're going to want to create some partnership with your child's school that you have to be really engaged, right? It's not going to feel good. It's going to be very triggering for you to have to be doing that all the time. So we have to be really conscientious about childhood trauma that exists in our parents, and that we can navigate that respectfully and encourage positive relationships with them. And a lot of that is just, again, so much relationship building, so much relationship building. And that even as administrative professionals, we also experience fatigue because we're having to hold so much of the weight of the community. And so that we're also taking good care of ourselves as administrators, whether that's learning new things in webinars like this, or also doing that our own self-care. And of course, we all wish self-care could just be about rosé and bubble baths, but unfortunately, there's so much more to it than that. So doing that self-care, taking care of our own mental health is really powerful as well. So we're going to open up a little bit of questions, really, and see what people might need to know.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from our attendees. We've got 5 people here. And, you know, I've got some questions for you and just some thoughts.
Sure.
I imagine, you know, most of our member base are administrators, you know, looking to reach new families and also, you know, cultivate the community that they have currently. So retention is a really big piece. But I imagine administrators that are listening to this want to know, Colleen, how can they get this information for their guides? Because we all know how incredibly important this is. And I think you did a fantastic job of convincing us of that and reminding us of really why we chose Montessori in the first place.
Right.
You know, and there's so much work that can be done to really change this world. And I know, you know, it starts with our guides and how we're able to support our guides in doing that in the classroom. So how can they get a hold of you and get, you know, this information that you've so graciously shared with us?
Sure. So a quick and easy way is my website. It's www.colleenwilkinson.com. There's sort of an outline there of what I do. I do half day, full day PD or 90-minute PD. And then also I do parent education nights. So those have been really successful for folks as well, where I go in and I sort of explain this, the science of engagement and why Montessori schools engage in a different way than traditional education for folks. So parent education, professional development, it's all on my website, and there's a contact form there as well. Or they're welcome to email me at traumainformedmontessori@gmail.com. And if you have younger millennial teachers like myself, they are, I'm on Instagram at Trauma-Informed Montessori, and that is, I share tips, tricks, information and research daily on my Instagram. So there's always something happening there. And it's also a place I use to network with a lot of other providers like Britt Hawthorne, Tiffany Jewell, other folks doing equity and Montessori work. So it's a great platform. Social media has really transformed the way we connect, hasn't it?
Absolutely. It's opened up, you know, of course there's controversy around it's like too much information but
Sure.
I think it really comes back to, you know, like you have so much more access to information. We have to, I mean, executive functioning skills are incredibly important now.
Yeah.
Because you have to be able to, you know, weed out all the stuff that doesn't make sense, which is important to remember because our parents are experiencing that.
Absolutely.
You know, our parents are trying to figure out what is the best route for their child. And the ones that are enrolled in your schools are still trying to figure it out. You know, we put so much emphasis on helping them understand Montessori and what we do and how we do it and why it's important. And I think keeping in mind that parents are constantly bombarded with decision making.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't just start from when they're new parents, it continues through your entire program.
All the time. And I mean, I'll tell you, on the other end, as the parent of a 17-year-old, it just doesn't stop.
It never will. You will always be mama.
Yeah, it keeps evolving in different ways, but there's always another decision to be made and a learning curve of things to learn from what I thought I knew. Now I need a whole new set of information.
Absolutely. Well, Colleen, it doesn't look good like we have, oh wait, we did. Emily has one. How do you know when it is time to say goodbye to a child or family? And Emily, I assume you mean goodbye in a way that they're just not the right fit.
Not a fit, yeah. I think it is a really, it's a really powerful thing to have worked in partnership with a family. And when we've said to a family, like, we need you to go for an evaluation, we need you to seek some outside help, and they're following those steps. I'm willing to work with a family for a long time when they're going through the steps and getting that outside support, or finding ways to get the support they need in the classroom, such as a speech therapist coming in, or so forth and so on. However, I think when we do that, not only is it great that they're doing what we need to get their child support, but we're also building relationship and trust with that family, right? That what I'm saying is, I want to help your child. I want to help your child. I want your child to be successful. And when we're willing to work with them for a period of time, trying to get those needs met, that's what we're telling them. We want your child to be here, right? And then when we have to finally sit down and say, I think I have to tell you that there's so much more to your child's needs than our community can meet. For me, I find it's always helpful if we can tell them where they should go next. Often the public school system is, required by law to meet the needs of a child. So I might suggest they reach out to their local school district and say, are their legal, or is their child legally entitled to under the IDEA laws? But that is the piece too of, like, it's not just that I'm asking you to leave, but that I believe your child needs more help, and here's where I think you should go get it. Now, they don't have to take my advice, and I always like to say that too, like, this is just my thought. You might find a different way. There are therapeutic private schools. This is the path for public school. Or sometimes if I think they're not ready to hear, and it's hard because sometimes people aren't ready to hear that their child has a special need that might require that level of intervention. And the thing is that, we might, especially if you work like I do in the first plane of development, we might be the first messengers, but we won't be the last, right? So sometimes we just have to let the universe give that message. Tamara used to tell me, Emily, that it takes 7 times for them to hear that message before it sinks in. And I don't know if that was her anecdotal experience or good data she got from somewhere, but 7 times. So if they're not hearing me, what I might say is, our classroom just doesn't seem to be working for Johnny. I'm wondering if he might be more successful in this environment. If he goes on to that environment and he's not successful in a public school setting, there's a release valve for that, because they will have to do evaluations and all that kind of thing. So that is my usual go-to. Support. As long as the family is working together, we're building connection, we're building respect. They know I want their child there. They know, because the whole Montessori community is doing so much work about inclusion of special needs children in our schools and what that looks like. I think we're actually at the precipice of a really big moment for special education inclusion in Montessori and what that could look like. There's some really great programs out there, because at a certain point, and the reason I say special ed is because in 2015, some folks sued Compton ISD out in California to qualify the need for trauma-informed care as a part of special education services. That this was so impactful on the child's brain that they should be included. So sometimes that is also now opening up an avenue. Specifically, if it's trauma, but also we just know that there are times when it's not trauma, or we don't know what it is, but that there's needs we can't meet. And that's just reality, I think, of the limitations of private school, for sure. Hopefully that was rambly, but there we go.
That was good. You've got a fan. Emily is.
Oh.
I have a question for you. When we're engaging with parents and really, initially working with them on helping to identify some of the struggles that their child is going through, do you have particular resources that you like to point them towards to help with self-regulation at home? And I'm thinking, because I was a lower elementary guide, I would always I'd always say something about mindfulness, but even just programs that you can do at home to get, that brain regulation back. Yeah.
I often suggest for people stuff like the Out of Sync Child and the Out of Sync Child Has Fun, which are really about sensory processing stuff. But they're really great resources for just like learning how to be in your body, which can be a struggle for students. Also, I Love You Rituals by Becky Bailey, who does conscious discipline, is a really strong has a really strong little set of fun things that parents and children can do together, and that some of which can even be modified for the classroom, and that are tools for building relationship. And if they're building relationship at home and being really mindful and connected at home, then we should start to see gains in the classroom as well. Because sometimes the cure of the problem is, especially if we're seeking relationship or seeking connection, that parents don't know how to do that either, right? They're trying, their ways of being taught are different than what the child needs. And so that goes back to like parenting the child we have, not the ideals we have, right? So we have to really be conscious of that. So that I Love You Rituals by Becky Bailey, The Out of Sync Child and The Out of Sync Child Has Fun. And I can't remember the author of those two books, but they're really great. And then of course, if I know a child has had traumatic experiences, especially if a parent's been able to articulate that to me, then I suggest a book called The Connected Child. It is by Karen Purvis, and it's the core component of TBRI parenting is called The Connected Child. And that's really great for when you know a child has experienced something adverse in their childhood.
Great resources. Because, parents are always looking for something. I remember in my conferences, it's just, what more can I do? What more can I do? And I want to make sure, we've got things out there that we can give them that they can try, because they want to learn. They, just like children, want to do the best that they can in parenting, and there's
That's
no right. There's
Everyone's
no
doing the best they can all the time. Another thing I love about that Karen Purvis work is because there's a ton of YouTube videos. Because if parents are like me, they probably have a stack of books on their bedside that, like, oh, I'm going to read all these really great, powerful books. They're like just sitting there waiting for me to one day crack the cover. But there's a lot of TBRI and Karen Purvis videos on YouTube where you can, 10 minutes, I can watch a video and have gained a new practical skill is so powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Colleen, oh my goodness, you are doing such important work. We're so thankful for you to share all of this amazing stuff. And I imagine you have sparked a lot of interest and, just more deeper work in what we truly can do and achieve in a Montessori classroom. So thank you so much.
I hope so. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'll make sure, members, to add the resources that Colleen had mentioned, so you can check those out. But Colleen, we'd love to have you back sometime in the future, just even to see, what you've been up to and what you've discovered, over time, and continue to, evolve your practice too, because this is a fairly new space for you to dive into, correct?
Yeah, I've been doing this work for, about 3 years now. So in terms of teaching adults, this is a new realm of work for me, so I'm excited about it.
Awesome. Well, feel free to reach out anything that you need. We've got amazing members that are heavily invested in improving their practice and really, helping parents and families and children just do their best. So thank you again, Colleen, for joining us. And thank you for our attendees, especially Emily, who chatted in. We love to have a lively conversation. We do these every Thursday, 10:30 a.m. Pacific time, 1:30 Eastern time. So we hope to see you next week. Thank you again, Colleen.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.